When I got into college during my first year at Kansas State, I was miserable every single day. Like, it was a palpable misery that I could feel. And it was during the second semester of my freshman year, I decided to sign up for a class called Medieval Political and Social Thought. And just to give you a bit of a backstory here, like, even though in high school, after I became Christian again, I started a preaching ministry because, as I said before, especially after I listened to Sir Roger Scruton, I was really interested in re-enchanting people's view of the world. And so I preached about cultural evangelism. I preached about how do you reach people today who don't believe in grand narratives, who have lost faith and hope in God and institutional religion. And so the focus of my ministry, especially at the conferences and churches I preached at, was how do you minister to people today? How do we go from Christendom to secularism? And so I took this class during the second semester of my freshman year, and that was the precise subject of the class. How do we get from Christendom to secularism? And so we read, the greats like Aristotle, Socrates, Aquinas, and all them. And then eventually we read the book A Secular Age by Charles Taylor.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah, and in that book, we learned about how the Protestant Reformation led to secularism. And it was just like a brick fell on my head. That's how it felt. Because I was like, wait, my tradition, the thing that I've aligned myself with.
What was his basic argument for how that happened?
Yeah. So there's a lot of inner working pieces of his argument, and so I don't want to say that I remember them all. I don't remember all of them. But let me just reiterate at least what I got from the class and what I think happened, right? So I think what happens is that one is that the Reformation is a fundamental break from the Christian tradition. It's a fundamental kind of recreation of yourself, right? And so we'll create Christianity now in our image. We'll go back to the scriptures. We don't need the institution. We don't need the tradition. What we need is just the Bible itself, okay? And at that process then, with that rupture of tradition, it goes down to the individual, okay? So then it's not hard to see then how secular liberal democracy kind of came out of this kind of view of the world, where, you had people disagreeing all the time about doctrines and scriptures, and they were killing each other over it because they had no universal authority they subscribed to anymore, and they didn't believe that there could be a universal authority to subscribe to. And so they had to develop these doctrines like, let's agree to disagree, let's tolerate each other, especially in the writings of Voltaire and others during this time. They're like, guys, let's just tolerate and live together despite our disagreements, right? There wasn't an urge to really settle the matter on a universal level. You'd have private theologians write about it, but there wasn't a way to actually settle it definitively for all of Christendom, right? And so at this point then, you get the inner workings of a secular liberal democracy, a secular liberal democratic order, and at the same time also you lose a sacramental view of reality. Now, this doesn't mean that that Lutherans or Protestants don't believe in some form of sacramental realism, right? But that view begins to go out the window slowly but surely, especially with Zwingli and others today.
And then your own tradition, the Baptist tradition.
Right, exactly. It's just a symbol, the Eucharist, that is. Yeah. And so at that point, then, the material world and the supernatural realm become two separate realities, at least functionally speaking, within your own liturgy. Right, and that, of course, the liturgy bleeds into society as well. And so at that point then, the idea that like God's interaction with the world is kind of like in this Epicurean model becomes popular, right? And so what I mean by that, and this is something that N.T. Wright has proposed, so it's not my original idea, is that God has to kind of force his hand into the natural world in order to make things work. And so, take something like Paley's watch, right? On its own, the natural world couldn't create a watch. And so you need this kind of exterior, outside of the world designer to come in and impose order, right? That's what's going on here. And then in the process, like when evolution comes around, it's really easy just to do away with that view of the world because you don't have now this metaphysical sophistication of, let's say, reality participates in God, right? And God has built order and natural law into things themselves, right? That becomes a harder sell, right? And then God slowly but surely becomes kind of pushed to the back. A lot of this view of God as a fundamental metaphysical explanation kind of goes out the window. You get the rise of voluntarism, of divine command theory, right? That the dictates of God is what has to determine objective morality. And at this point too, you have the scientific revolution happening not too long after the Reformation. And so at this point then you get a view of reality that is mechanistic. So you get a philosophy of nature that believes that we're basically machines, that doesn't believe in kind of this top-down causation, but that everything is just a conglomerate of parts. Okay, and so at this point, I remember I think it's Thomas Hobbes, who's a famous proponent of the mechanical philosophy of nature. He says that Aristotle is a tool for the Pope. And so Aristotle gets thrown out the window. And of course, like the scientific revolution, a lot of things about Aristotle get kicked out, except for the metaphysics, as other people would argue. But a lot of the Aristotelian science gets thrown out. So in the process, all these things are happening together, and ultimately, the Protestant world is left without this foundation that it once had. And so it gets hit harder than I would say than the Catholic worldview, so to speak, at that point. And so that's how secularism comes about, because when you start saying that, okay, Catholics are superstitious for believing in the real presence, or you start saying things like Catholics are superstitious for believing in rituals and all that, you don't really sound that far off from the materialists who think we're superstitious for believing in the virgin birth, the death and resurrection of Christ, or the incarnation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
If you like that clip, be sure to like and subscribe. Cheers.